In the quiet town of Brookwood, Olivia Davis's life was about to change forever when she unexpectedly crossed paths with Ethan Roberts, her powerful ex-husband. What started as a simple meeting at a bus stop would uncover a past she had kept hidden, one that would forever alter the future. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for more stories like this. Thank you for your support. Let's dive into the story. On a chilly morning in the town of Brookwood, a place where the air always seemed to have a quiet, comforting touch, Olivia Davis stood at a bus stop. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, waiting for the familiar hum of the approaching bus. Wrapped in a soft, cozy blanket was her infant son, Leo, whose small face peeked out, peaceful and content. Olivia looked down at him with a tenderness only a mother could know. Leo was a miracle, a gift she cherished with all her heart, and nothing in the world could disturb the calm she felt while holding him. But as the bus drew closer, an unexpected sound shattered the serenity. The growl of an engine, deep and powerful, echoed in the distance. Before she could react, a sleek black sports car came to a smooth stop at the curb. The car, polished and gleaming in the early morning light, was out of place in this quiet town. Olivia instinctively turned her head, a sense of unease rushing over her as the vehicle came to a halt, and then she saw him. Ethan Roberts, the last person she ever expected or wanted to see today. The tall, imposing figure standing by the car was none other than Ethan, the CEO of Roberts Enterprises, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the city. His face, so familiar, so sharp and unreadable, had once been the one she had loved. That was a lifetime ago, it felt like. She hadn't seen him in years. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him, and she quickly averted her eyes, hoping he wouldn't notice her. But it was too late. Their eyes met, and in that moment, time seemed to stand still. Ethan's gaze locked on hers for a fraction of a second, his sharp eyes narrowing, before he stepped toward her. Olivia instinctively shifted her grip on Leo, her heart racing. "Is that your son?" Ethan's voice was low, but there was an undeniable urgency to it. He looked at Leo, whose face was partially hidden in the folds of his blanket. His voice softened as his eyes traced the outline of the baby, his expression tense and confused. Olivia didn't know how to respond. It was as if the words were caught in her throat, tangled in a web of emotions she wasn't ready to confront. She hesitated for a moment, still avoiding his gaze, before finally whispering, "Yes, my son." But there was something in the way Ethan looked at Leo that made Olivia feel like she was standing at the edge of a precipice. His gaze was fixed on the baby, an intensity in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. And yet, it wasn't just curiosity. It was something more. Recognition, perhaps? A dawning realization she couldn't quite place. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath hitching as she quickly turned and stepped onto the bus, the doors sliding shut behind her. Ethan stood frozen by the curb, his eyes still locked on her, and Olivia could feel his gaze burning into her, even as the bus pulled away. The unease that had washed over her now churned into something darker, uncertainty, fear. But most of all, confusion. What had just happened? Why did she feel so exposed, so vulnerable? As the bus rumbled down the road, Olivia sat quietly, her hands cradling Leo against her chest. The world outside the window passed by, but her thoughts were consumed by the encounter with Ethan. Her heart was still racing, and she couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over in her mind. Ethan's voice, the way his eyes had lingered on Leo, the look on his face, what did it all mean? Her pulse quickened as she remembered the way Ethan had looked at Leo, the way he had studied him. There was something about the baby's eyes, those striking, unmistakable green eyes, that had made Ethan pause. Olivia had noticed it too. Leo's eyes were one of the first things she had seen in him when he was born. They were bright and full of life, and they mirrored something about Ethan, something she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. But now, as the memory of Ethan's expression replayed in her mind, the recognition hit her with full force. Ethan had noticed it too. He had seen what she had been trying to avoid. The bus continued on its route, but Olivia felt as though the world around her had slowed down. The weight of the encounter with Ethan pressed down on her chest. She tried to push away the growing sense of dread, but it refused to leave. The one person she had never wanted to see again had just come face to face with her son. Her thoughts spiraled. Had he figured it out? Did he realize the truth? Her breath caught in her throat. Could Ethan know? Could he have recognized Leo as his own child? But the truth was something she had buried deep inside herself. She hadn't told him. She hadn't told anyone. The decision to keep Leo's paternity a secret had been hers alone. It had been a choice she'd made in the depths of her heartbreak, and now she wasn't sure if she could keep hiding it any longer. The idea that Ethan might have already put the pieces together was terrifying. She hadn't been ready for this. She wasn't ready to face him, to explain the years of silence, to confront the past that had torn them apart. When Olivia arrived at her stop, she was nearly paralyzed by the weight of her thoughts. She carried Leo into her apartment, the space that had been her sanctuary for the past few years. But even here, in the quiet of her home, she couldn't escape the questions Ethan had left in her mind. Meanwhile, back at his office, Ethan was far from his usual composed self. The meeting at the bus stop had left him reeling, his mind unable to focus on anything else. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in that brief exchange, something important. The way Leo's eyes had mirrored his own, it had unsettled him, and he found himself unable to move past it. "Find out everything you can about Olivia Davis," he ordered his assistant, his voice cold and clipped. "I need to know who she is, where she's from, what she's been doing." His mind raced. The more he thought about it, the more he couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that something had changed, something he hadn't anticipated. His assistant returned quickly with the information. Olivia Davis was living quietly in Brookwood, working as a freelance writer. No husband, no long-term partner, no sign of a family. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he processed the information. It wasn't just her background that shocked him, it was the absence of anything that would explain Leo. Why hadn't she told him about their son? Was Leo his? The question swirled in Ethan's mind. He couldn't ignore the striking resemblance between Leo and himself. He couldn't forget the way the baby had looked at him, those eyes, so familiar, so unmistakable. He needed answers. He needed to know the truth. The sense of unease that had taken root in him at the bus stop had now blossomed into full-blown confusion and frustration. There was only one way to get the answers he needed. He had to find Olivia. Ethan sat in his high-rise office, staring out at the sprawling city below. The lights of the skyscrapers flickered in the distance, but his mind was miles away. He couldn't shake the image of Olivia standing there at the bus stop, holding their son in her arms. Leo's eyes, that unmistakable shade of green, had haunted him ever since. He had never believed in the idea of fate, but something about this felt like it was meant to be. It wasn't just a coincidence that the baby looked so much like him. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to focus on his work, but the questions kept bubbling up, drowning out the business concerns that usually consumed him. Was Leo his child? The possibility gnawed at him. He remembered the way Olivia had looked at him when their eyes met. There was something there. But why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept this secret for so long? The thought of Olivia keeping something so significant from him stirred up old emotions. Anger, confusion, betrayal. Their relationship had ended so bitterly. When they were together, he had been so focused on his career, so afraid of the idea of commitment, of family, that he had pushed her away. And now, all these years later, he had no idea that he had a son. The weight of that realization hit him harder than he expected. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Ethan called his assistant again. "I want a full background check on Olivia Davis. I want to know everything. Her past, her life, everything she's been doing since we parted ways." His assistant's response was swift. "Of course, Mr. Roberts. I'll have the information for you by the end of the day." Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his thoughts. The past few years had been a blur of success and ambition, but nothing had prepared him for the shock of finding out he had a son. As his assistant worked on gathering information, Ethan's mind wandered to Olivia. What had happened to her after they broke up? She had been so full of life back then, so hopeful and driven. He wondered if she still carried those same dreams, or if life had taken a different toll on her. He thought about visiting her, but something stopped him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face her, not yet. Not until he had answers. And until then, he needed to keep control of his emotions. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. The moment he saw Leo, he had been drawn into a web of emotions that he couldn't escape. The days that followed were a blur of restlessness. Ethan couldn't concentrate on anything else. His assistant had gathered all the information he needed about Olivia. She had been living in Brookwood, leading a quiet life as a freelance writer. There were no signs of a new relationship, no evidence of a marriage. She was living alone with Leo, raising him in a small apartment. The more Ethan learned, the more questions he had. How had Olivia kept this secret? And why hadn't she told him? Unable to wait any longer, Ethan decided it was time to confront her. He needed answers, and he couldn't keep living in this state of uncertainty. He knew where she lived. He had found that much out. So, after a few days of mulling over the situation, he made the decision to pay her a visit. Arriving at her apartment complex, Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He hadn't seen Olivia in years, and the emotions from their past had never fully dissipated. There had been so many things left unsaid, so many unresolved issues. Now, as he stood outside her door, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment where everything would finally come to light. He knocked, his heart pounding in his chest. A long moment passed before the door creaked open. Olivia stood there, her eyes wide with surprise, her face pale. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was so much unsaid in the air between them. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" Olivia's voice was shaky, but there was strength in it. She stepped back slightly, as if she wanted to keep her distance, but Ethan didn't move. His presence was too overpowering. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice firm but tinged with an urgency he couldn't hide. "Olivia, is he mine?" His question hung in the air, heavy and immediate. He couldn't keep it inside any longer. For a long moment, Olivia didn't respond. She looked at Leo, who was quietly asleep in her arms, before slowly meeting Ethan's gaze. Her eyes were full of pain, and Ethan saw the tears that threatened to spill. She bit her lip, trying to hold back the emotion, before finally whispering, "Yes, he's yours." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. All these years, he had lived without knowing the truth, without knowing that he had a son. His mind raced, his chest tightening, with a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. "How could you not tell me?" Ethan asked, his voice rough with emotion. He took a step forward, his mind reeling from the revelation. "How could you keep this from me, Olivia?" She lowered her gaze, the weight of his question bearing down on her. Olivia's hands trembled as she gently rocked Leo in her arms, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to. We were both so lost back then. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to bring a child into the mess we were in. I was scared, Ethan." Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as she spoke. The pain in her voice was raw, and Ethan felt his heart twist. "But why didn't you tell me?" he repeated, his anger now mixed with sorrow. "Why didn't you give me a chance to be there for him? For both of you?" Olivia finally looked up, her eyes red and filled with regret. "I didn't want to drag you back into this life, Ethan. You had your career, your future, and I wasn't ready to ask you for anything. I thought it would be better this way." Her words pierced through him, but they also made him realize something. Olivia had kept Leo from him because she had been trying to protect him. But in doing so, she had created a chasm between them that now felt impossible to cross. Ethan stood there in stunned silence, his mind reeling. He had never imagined his life would turn out like this. He had never imagined he would find out, all these years later, that he had a son, one who looked so much like him, whose eyes mirrored his own. The truth was out now, and Ethan knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of Olivia's revelation settling in his chest like a stone. His heart beat loudly in his ears, his mind struggling to comprehend the words that had just come from her lips. "He's yours." The realization crashed over him in waves, each one more overwhelming than the last. His son, Leo. He had a child he hadn't known about, a child who had been living just a few miles away from him all this time. He had missed everything. Leo's first steps, his first words, his first smile. And now, all the years of not knowing were gone in an instant, replaced by a flood of questions and pain. "How could you not tell me, Olivia?" Ethan's voice was a low, guttural demand, as if speaking any louder might cause him to lose control. His eyes searched her face for some kind of explanation, But what he saw in her expression only deepened the confusion. "I didn't want to," Olivia whispered, looking down at Leo as she rocked him gently in her arms. "I didn't want to involve you in all of this. After everything we went through, I thought it was better for him if you didn't know." Ethan's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. He had been a fool, so consumed by his own career, by his own fears and insecurities, that he hadn't seen the real consequences of his actions. He had pushed Olivia away, and now, as if fate had come full circle, he was standing here, demanding answers and realizing that he had missed out on everything. "I don't understand," he said, his voice cracking as he stepped into the apartment, his presence a mixture of desperation and anger. "How could you keep this from me? How could you raise my son without telling me, without even giving me the chance to be a part of his life?" Olivia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and for a moment, she looked as if she was about to break. Her hands trembled, and she lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. "It wasn't easy, Ethan," she said softly. "You think I didn't want to tell you? I wanted to. But every time I thought about it, I remembered how you were back then, how you pushed me away. I couldn't risk bringing him into that mess. And then time went by, and it just became harder to tell you. I thought maybe it was too late." Ethan felt his chest tighten as he listened to her. The anger he had felt began to shift into something else, something more painful: regret. He had been so blind to what was happening, so consumed with the idea that everything had to be perfect, that he had missed the most important part of life. And now, all he could do was stand here, unable to undo the damage. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, feeling like he was suffocating in the weight of his own mistakes. "I don't know what to do now." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's eyes were fixed on Leo, who was now awake and watching them, his small hands reaching out as if sensing the tension in the room. Olivia's soft voice finally broke the silence. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan," she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to make things worse. And now, seeing you here, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I don't know how we can fix this. I don't know if we can." Ethan's heart broke as he looked at Olivia, at the tears in her eyes, and then at the baby she had raised on her own. The guilt that washed over him was overwhelming. He had hurt her, abandoned her when she needed him most. And now he was learning that he had missed out on the most important thing in his life, the son he never knew he had. "I can't just walk away," Ethan said, his voice firm with determination, though it was laced with emotion. "I won't walk away from him. I won't walk away from you." Olivia's gaze softened, but there was still fear in her eyes. She had been doing this on her own for so long, she wasn't sure if she could trust him again. She wasn't sure if she could trust herself. "I don't know how to let you back in, Ethan," she whispered. "I don't know if I can." Ethan reached out slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for things to go back to the way they were, but he was asking for a chance to prove himself, a chance to be the man and the father he should have been all along. Just as the tension between them began to settle, the sound of a sharp knock on the door interrupted the fragile peace. Olivia's face immediately paled, and she stiffened in place. Ethan looked at her, confused, but Olivia's eyes darted to the door in a way that made him uncomfortable. She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether she should answer, but before she could move, the door creaked open on its own. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a smug expression on his face that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. His suit was sharp, but the way he carried himself, like someone who had been through too much, gave him an air of danger. "Adrien," Olivia muttered, her voice tinged with both dread and resignation. Ethan's mind immediately began to work, piecing together the situation. He had never heard of Adrien Clark before, but from Olivia's reaction, it was clear that this man wasn't someone she wanted to see. "Olivia," Adrien said with a cruel smile, "I was wondering when you'd be showing up again." His eyes flickered over to Ethan, a knowing glint in them. "And who is this? Your new friend?" Ethan stood straighter, his protective instincts flaring. "Who are you?" he asked coldly, his voice low. Adrien's smile widened as he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "I think you and I need to have a little chat. I know all about Olivia's situation." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And I think it's time we settle our debts. Wouldn't you agree?" Olivia's face turned pale as she stepped in front of Leo instinctively, shielding him from Adrien's gaze. Ethan's protective instinct flared to life immediately, and he stepped closer to Olivia, his body language showing no tolerance for this intruder. "You're not welcome here," Ethan said, his voice as cold as ice. "Leave now, before I make you." Adrien chuckled, as if Ethan's threat was a joke, and turned to Olivia. "You can't hide from the past, Olivia. You owe me, and I don't take kindly to people trying to run away from their debts." Ethan's blood ran cold. Whatever this man was threatening, it was clear he had some kind of hold over Olivia, one that she had been hiding from him. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Adrien, his voice hard and menacing. "Stay away from her, and stay away from my son. If you want to fight, you've got one." Adrien's smile faltered, but he wasn't intimidated. Instead, he leaned back with a calculating look in his eyes. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Ethan wasn't sure what kind of man Adrien was, but it didn't matter. Whoever he was a threat to Olivia and Leo, and Ethan wasn't about to let that slide. As Adrien turned and walked out, the air in the room seemed to thicken with tension. Olivia let out a long breath, but the worry in her eyes remained. Ethan knew one thing for sure now. This wasn't over, and if Adrien was going to make things difficult for Olivia, Ethan was ready to fight for her, for Leo, whatever it took. As the door closed behind Adrien, Olivia let out a shaky breath, her hand gripping Leo a little tighter. Ethan stood there, still in the doorway, his fists clenched at his sides. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Ethan's gaze never left Olivia, studying her face. She looked pale, her usually calm demeanor shattered. It was clear that Adrien's presence had rattled her deeply, and Ethan couldn't stand it. He wanted to know everything, the whole truth, no more hiding. "Olivia," he said softly, taking a step forward. "What is going on here? Who is that guy? What does he want from you?" She hesitated, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably long. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Adrien Clark. He's someone I've been involved with a long time ago." Her words hung in the air, a bitter weight that neither of them could ignore. She paused, her eyes dropping to Leo, who had fallen back asleep in her arms, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. "He lent me money when I was struggling, but wasn't just money. There were conditions." Ethan frowned, his anger rising again. "Conditions? What kind of conditions?" Olivia closed her eyes, squeezing them shut as if the memory was too painful to bear. When she spoke again, her voice trembled. "I needed the money to pay for some unexpected expenses. I was desperate. And Adrien took advantage of that. He loaned me the money, but in return, he demanded favors. Things I never agreed to, things I couldn't get out of." Ethan's stomach churned with anger at the thought of another man, especially one like Adrien, exploiting Olivia's vulnerability. But what was worse was the realization that she had been carrying this burden alone. All this time, she had been living with this secret, fighting a battle Ethan never knew about. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me for help?" Ethan's voice was soft now, filled with hurt. "I could have helped you. I could have made sure you weren't alone in this." Olivia turned away from him, her shoulders trembling as she walked to the small window of the apartment, looking out at the city. "I didn't want to drag you back into this, Ethan. You were doing so well, and I couldn't risk ruining your life. I thought if I kept my distance, kept Leo away from all of this, it would be better for everyone." Ethan's heart broke at the sound of her words. She had carried this heavy burden alone, thinking it was better for him, better for Leo. But she had been wrong. They were in this together now, whether she liked it or not. "Olivia," Ethan said, his voice firm with determination, "you don't have to carry this alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But Adrien, he won't stop. He's already started to make things difficult. He's threatening to ruin me, ruin everything I've built." She shook her head, her expression stricken. "He has dirt on me, on things I did to survive. He'll use anything he can to force me into his control." Ethan's jaw clenched. He couldn't let this continue. Not when it was hurting Olivia. Not when it was threatening his son. "We'll take him down. I'll make sure he pays for what he's done. but we need to act fast. We need to gather everything we can on him, expose his dealings. If he has something on you, we'll make sure it's brought to light." Olivia looked at him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. She was still uncertain, still fearful of what might happen, but for the first time, she allowed herself to feel a small spark of hope. Ethan was offering her a lifeline, and despite everything, she was desperate to take it. "I don't know how to thank you, Ethan," she said softly, tears welling in her eyes. "You've already done more than I deserve." Ethan shook his head, his expression determined. "You don't need to thank me. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. For you, for Leo, and for us." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. He wasn't going to let Adrien Clark tear apart the small family they were beginning to rebuild. "We'll handle this together," he said firmly, his gaze meeting Olivia's. "And we'll make sure Adrien doesn't get away with it." The next few days were a blur of planning, strategizing, and gathering as much information as they could. Ethan and Olivia spent long hours together, sifting through files, making calls, and consulting with lawyers who could help them expose Adrien's illegal activities. The tension between them had slowly begun to shift from one of confusion and hurt to something more focused, more determined. There was still so much unsaid between them, but they both knew they had to push forward for the sake of Leo, for the sake of the family they were just beginning to build. Ethan had already reached out to his team of legal experts and private investigators. They started gathering evidence on Adrien's shady business dealings, his criminal connections, and anything that could be used to bring him down. Every new piece of information they uncovered made Ethan more furious. Adrien had been running a web of extortion and fraud, using his power to manipulate vulnerable people like Olivia. As the hours passed, Ethan found himself more and more invested in their plan. It wasn't just about taking down Adrien anymore. It was about making sure Olivia was safe, that Leo was protected, and that they could have a future without fear hanging over their heads. In the quiet moments when they weren't working, Ethan and Olivia would steal glances at each other. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, something they hadn't shared in years. The awkwardness that had once existed between them was slowly fading as they began to work as a team. Ethan found himself drawn to her again, not just as the woman he had once loved, but as a mother, a partner in this fight. "Are you sure about this?" Olivia asked one evening, her voice hesitant as she looked at Ethan. "We're going up against a powerful man. He has resources, connections. This isn't going to be easy." Ethan nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I'm sure. We've come this far. We're not backing down now. We'll bring Adrien down. I'm not going to let him hurt you anymore." Olivia looked at him, her eyes softening. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean into the warmth of his promise. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't so scared of it. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice steadying. "Let's do this. Together." As they moved forward with their plan, a new sense of hope began to grow between them. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years they had lost, they were moving towards something new, something better. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, they were walking it side by side, and no matter what Adrien threw at them, they would face it together. The hours turned into days as Ethan and Olivia poured their energy into their plan to bring Adrien Clark down. Their research was yielding results. More connections to shady deals, more evidence of extortion and fraudulent activities. They were close to exposing Adrien for the criminal he was, but just as they began to feel the weight of their progress, Adrien struck back with a vengeance. Ethan was in his office, reviewing the latest batch of documents from his team when he received a call. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the urgency in the caller's voice made him answer. "Ethan, you need to hear this," the voice on the other end said quickly. "It's about Adrien." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What's happened? Adrien's gone public. He's spreading rumors about your business practices. He's targeting you personally, trying to tarnish your reputation. He's also making threats about Olivia. He's trying to force her to back off. He's got people working behind the scenes to make things difficult for you." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. The audacity of Adrien to attack him where it hurt most, His reputation, his business, was infuriating. But it wasn't just the rumors that hit hardest. It was the threat to Olivia that made his blood boil. Adrien was playing dirty, but Ethan was ready to fight back. He hung up the phone and immediately called Olivia, his mind racing. He could hear the worry in her voice when she picked up. "Ethan? What's going on?" "Adrien's going after both of us. He's spreading lies about me, about my company, and he's putting pressure on you, trying to get you to back off." His voice was tight with anger, but he quickly reassured her. "We knew this would happen. It's just part of the game, but we're not backing down." Olivia took a deep breath. "I knew it was only a matter of time before he fought back. He's ruthless, Ethan. He'll stop at nothing. I'm not letting him win. We'll stand our ground, Olivia. We have to keep going. This isn't over." Olivia hesitated, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She could feel the tension in the air, the overwhelming pressure of it all, but she knew Ethan was right. They couldn't back down now. They had to see it through. "Okay," she said, her voice steady but tinged with the anxiety she couldn't quite shake. "What's our next move?" Ethan thought for a moment. "We keep going after him. We keep gathering the evidence we need to make him pay for everything he's done. But we need to be careful. Adrien's got resources, and he's not afraid to use them. We can't afford to make any missteps." They both understood what was at stake. Adrien was playing a dangerous game, but they were determined to expose him for the fraud he was. The stakes had just gotten higher, and it was more than just their futures at risk. It was Leo's future, too. The tension had been building for weeks, but now, with everything on the line, Ethan and Olivia knew the time had come to confront Adrien Clarke. They had spent every waking moment preparing, gathering evidence, meeting with lawyers, working with investigators. They had assembled a mountain of proof, and now it was time to put it all to use. They had one final piece to their plan, an undeniable piece of evidence that would expose Adrien for the criminal he was. But getting it to the authorities wouldn't be easy. Adrien had eyes everywhere, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Ethan and Olivia knew that the risk they were about to take was enormous, but they had no choice. Adrien's lavish office was the battleground for this final confrontation. His sleek, modern space was a reflection of the wealth and power he had accumulated through manipulation and deceit. But as Ethan and Olivia stepped into the room, side by side, there was no fear in their eyes. They had come prepared. Adrien sat behind his desk, a smug smile on his face as he looked up from the papers in front of him. "Well, well," he said with a sneer. "Look who finally decided to show up. I was beginning to think you'd chicken out." Ethan stood tall, his presence commanding the room. "This ends today, Adrien. We have everything we need to take you down." Adrien's smile faltered for the first time. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about? You think you can bring me down with some pathetic little accusations? You have no idea what you're up against." Olivia stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We're not accusing you of anything, Adrien. We have proof. Hard, irrefutable evidence of your illegal dealings, your fraud, your extortion, the way you've manipulated people. It's all here." She placed a folder on the desk, the contents containing detailed records of Adrien's shady business practices. Ethan stepped forward and opened the folder, placing it on the desk for Adrien to see. "This is over," Ethan said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You're finished." For a moment, Adrien sat in stunned silence, his face contorting with rage as he realized that his empire of lies was crumbling around him. He stood up suddenly, slamming his fist on the desk. "You think you can ruin me?" he growled. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll destroy you both before you even get the chance to see the consequences." But Ethan wasn't intimidated. "We already know what you're capable of, Adrien. But your time's up. The authorities are already on their way." The door to Adrien's office swung open, and uniformed officers entered, their presence undeniable. Adrien's face turned pale as the officers moved to arrest him. His entire demeanor shifted from arrogant confidence to panic. As the police handcuffed Adrien and escorted him out of the office, Ethan and Olivia stood together, watching the man who had once held so much power over their lives crumble before them. It was over. Adrien's reign of terror was finished. For a brief moment, Olivia's eyes met Ethan's, and in that glance, they shared something that hadn't existed between them in a long time: relief. The weight that had been pressing down on them for so long was lifting. They had won. But as the police car pulled away, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning of their journey. There were still wounds to heal, bridges to rebuild, and though the past had been dark and painful, the future now held a glimmer of hope. Ethan turned to Olivia, a quiet promise in his eyes. "We did it. Now we can move forward." Olivia nodded, a small, hopeful smile forming on her lips. "Yes, together." The weeks following Adrien's arrest were filled with both relief and an unsettling sense of uncertainty. Ethan and Olivia had won the battle, but there was still so much left to rebuild. Olivia had come to terms with the fact that she didn't have to carry the burden of her past alone anymore. And Ethan had proved that he was there for her, not just for Leo, but for herself too. Yet, even with Adrien behind bars and their immediate danger behind them, the damage to their relationship had not been easily undone. Time had passed since the days of their painful breakup, and the hurt and mistrust they had shared still lingered in the air, like an invisible wall between them. It was a constant reminder that, although they had fought together, they were still on the road to healing, not just from the trauma Adrien had caused, but from the deep emotional wounds that had been inflicted on each other in the past. Ethan had always been a man of action, driven by his work and the pursuit of success. But after all that had happened, he found himself reflecting on his past mistakes, on how his fear of commitment had pushed Olivia away at the most crucial time. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he was determined to make things right. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple, Ethan and Olivia sat on the porch of her small apartment. Leo had just gone to bed, his small body curled up in his crib, and the quiet of the evening settled over them like a blanket. "Olivia, I owe you an apology," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I've spent years running from my mistakes, thinking I could fix everything with work, with success. But I was wrong. I hurt you when you needed me the most, and I'll never forgive myself for that." Olivia turned to face him, her eyes softening as she listened. She had heard the apology before, in fragments and whispered promises, but this time there was something different in his voice: sincerity, genuine remorse. "I was scared, Ethan. I didn't know how to be the man you needed me to be. I thought I had everything figured out, but I was wrong about so many things." His eyes met hers, and the weight of his words hung in the air between them. "I wasn't there for you when you needed me, and I can't take that back. But I want to make it right, Olivia. I want to be the man you deserve." Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to let the past hold her back any longer. "Ethan, I know you've changed. I see it in the way you look at Leo, in the way you're here for me now." She paused, her voice trembling. "I never stopped loving you. But you're right. Trust needs time to rebuild." Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I know, and I'm willing to give it time. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, Olivia. I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." For a long moment, they simply sat there, the quiet around them speaking louder than words ever could. The past was filled with regrets, but the future, though uncertain, was full of possibilities. And for the first time in years, they were both ready to take that first step toward healing, together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as Ethan looked at Olivia, as their hands remained intertwined, he knew that they could face whatever came next, as long as they faced it together. It had been several months since Adrien's arrest, and life had settled into a new rhythm for Ethan, Olivia, and Leo. The shadows of their past still lingered, but they were learning to let go, piece by piece, rebuilding what had been broken. Ethan had moved in with Olivia, and their lives, once defined by tension and uncertainty, now revolved around something far more important: family. Leo had quickly become the center of their world, his laughter filling the house and reminding them both of the love they still shared. They spent weekends at the family cabin just outside Brookwood, enjoying the quiet of the countryside and the simple joys of being together. It was there, surrounded by the trees and the gentle sounds of nature, that they truly began to heal. One crisp autumn morning, the family took a walk along the shore of a small lake near the cabin. Ethan held Leo in his arms, laughing as the toddler pointed excitedly at the ducks swimming nearby. Olivia walked beside him, her hand brushing against his every so often, a silent connection between them that needed no words. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Ethan asked, his voice soft as they watched Leo toddle along the path in front of them. Olivia smiled, her eyes soft with nostalgia. "I remember. We were so young, so full of dreams and fears we didn't even understand." Ethan stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her. "I was a fool back then, Olivia. I thought I had it all figured out, but I was so wrong. I didn't realize how important it was to be present, to be with you. And now I have everything I ever wanted. You, Leo, this life." Olivia's heart swelled as she looked at him, her hand gently resting on his chest. "I never stopped loving you, Ethan. I just had to learn to trust you again. And now, we're here, together." A sense of peace washed over them as they stood there, gazing at the lake and the future that lay before them. There were still things to work through, but the foundation was solid now. They were no longer haunted by the past, no longer weighed down by fear or regret. They had rebuilt what had once seemed lost. As Leo giggled nearby, chasing after a butterfly, Ethan and Olivia exchanged a smile. Their journey had been long, filled with pain and uncertainty, but it had led them here, to this moment of peace, to this family they had created together. And in that quiet moment, as they watched their son play, they both knew that they were ready for whatever the future held. For the first time, it felt like anything was possible. Together, they had built something stronger than they had ever imagined. A new family, a new beginning, and nothing could ever break them again. Years had passed since that fateful day when Ethan and Olivia had faced the man who had threatened to destroy their lives. The echoes of Adrien's manipulations had long since faded, but the journey that had followed had transformed them in ways they never could have imagined. The family cabin, once a symbol of their hopes and fears, had become their sanctuary, a place of peace where they could look back on their past without pain and forward to a future filled with promise. Leo was growing up fast, his laughter now a constant presence in their lives. The once quiet home had been filled with the joy of a child's first words, first steps, and first adventures. Ethan and Olivia's love, tested and battered, had blossomed into something stronger than either of them had dared to dream. Sitting together on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they had come to realize that the road they had traveled had been worth every hardship. It had brought them to this moment, united, whole, and ready for whatever came next. Ethan reached for Olivia's hand, his touch gentle and full of understanding. "I never thought we'd get here, but I'm glad we did." Olivia smiled, her eyes bright with the wisdom that only time could give. "We're here because we chose to fight for each other, and for Leo." Their eyes met, a silent promise passing between them. No matter what challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. They had built a life out of love and resilience, one that no one could take away. And as they sat there, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the sky, they knew one thing for sure. The past was behind them, but the future, full of hope and possibility, was theirs to embrace, together, as a family. Thank you so much for reading this story and for staying with us until the very end. We truly appreciate your time and support throughout this journey. If you enjoyed the tale of Ethan, Olivia, and Leo, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will tug at your heartstrings and keep you coming back for more. If you loved this journey, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment letting us know your thoughts. Your feedback means the world to us. And of course, don't forget to share this story with your friends and family. We hope you continue to enjoy our content, and we can't wait to bring you more exciting stories soon. Thanks again for being part of this adventure with us. Stay tuned for more.